that I'm kind of, the lenses that I am speaking from, and these are not all of them, these are just some of them. But first, being cisgender, I identify with the gender assignment that I was given. I'm heterosexual. I've been married to my husband for 8 years, but I've known him for 17 years. I attended parochial school my entire education. So that's 17 years of private school. That's a lens I'm operating from. This next one I like to kind of laugh about. I have no children, I have no pets, I have no responsibility. That's a lens that I operate from too. I grew up in San Jose, California. So I grew up in a pretty big city. And then I went back east for college to Rochester, New York for 4 years. So that's where my college education and my degree came from. And then after that, I moved to San Luis Obispo and have pretty much been here since that time. I had another short stint in the Bay Area, but most of my adult life has been in San Luis Obispo. And because of this kind of ties to my private school education, I've been involved with nonprofits for about 20 years in one way or another, because that is something that is a part of private school education, at least the education I was a part of. So I can't believe I can say I've been a part of that for 20 years, but I have, and I recognize that that is an interesting lens and also possibly a lens of privilege. So that's what I'm here to kind of chat about today, is about privilege that I've seen in the environmental sector, specifically around education and advocacy. And yeah, the next slide kind of talks about the workshop goals, which if you saw like the promotion for this, it's really about, this is an opportunity, I think, for me to share kind of like the local and like my personal experiences that I've had in this sector, as well as the nonprofit sector overall, and talking about volunteerism, I think is an interesting one to unpack a little bit too. So I'm just going to touch on that slightly through this. Also talking about language that can be really isolating or perhaps triggering rather than inviting. Exploring topics such as like access based on whatever lens you're coming from, but specifically around race, around your economic status or access, and ability. And then last thing around kind of, I'm going to give credit to one of ECOSLO's former AmeriCorps members, Eden Knapp, because when I shared this topic with her, she summed it up so perfectly well about, you know, there's actions that are well-intended, but are more complex than they seem. So I'll touch on that a little bit as well. And again, yeah, this is, okay, yeah, so I'll get started. No, it's okay. So my experience 6 years ago, when I started at ECOSLO, was everyone wanted to kind of talk about electric vehicles. And at the time I was pretty strict vegan. I'm not so strict anymore, but no one really wanted to talk about consuming less meat or even talk about factory farming. And I don't know if maybe that was this area or what it was, but I found it really interesting. And so that was one of the first things that, going back to kind of the workshop goals of like feeling like I was an outsider, not on the in of like the environmental sector. But that's just my lens. And I also wanted to preface before I go any further, I know that I've had a lot of access to privilege in my life, and I am a white woman who is privileged and who has had a lot of access. So I am coming from that lens, but I'm just sharing some of my experiences. And I think as we go through this, one thing that I've latched onto is, if you've heard of the author, Brene Brown, she talks about duality and like, you know, things being true at the same time. While I've had privilege, I've also felt like I haven't been invited to a community too, if that makes sense. So just going to throw that out there. So that was kind of my experience 6 years ago, was just a lot of people driving electric cars. I didn't have access to that, and just feeling like no one wanted to talk about other things. So some of the expectations or assumptions that I first experienced in this sector is, yes, having an electric vehicle, having solar. Don't use something like a dryer at home, or have everything on electric and be on solar, and don't use gas or fossil fuels or anything of any type. Biking everywhere, not using a vehicle, and don't have any plastic in my house, in my office, anywhere. Don't have any plastic. And it's not necessarily that, anyone said this to me directly. It's assumptions that I think maybe come from just being in this sector. Sometimes if we're advocating for clean energy, we're advocating for a lower impact on the planet, we're advocating for reusables instead of single-use items and things like that. So there's kind of like an undertone that sometimes comes out, or things that are said with language, I guess. So then the reality of just, and again, this is my lens, my perspective, and where I'm operating from, because I kind of shared where I'm operating from. But I don't have an electric vehicle because at the time I started ECOSLO, I was renting, and renting is not very accommodating to an electric vehicle. There's a lot of I would say that there's a lot of hurdles with that. And the same thing with economics or access to even getting an electric vehicle. Solar, again, I was a renter at the time. I now own a house. I'm lucky to own a house, but I have a really low electricity bill that it almost doesn't make sense to have solar. For me, using a dryer saves time. And I also want to share, like, some people don't have access to a dryer and they have to hang their clothes, and like there's dualities there, if that makes sense. But for me, like, I had someone say, you use a dryer, you're the executive director of ECOSLO, why are you using a dryer? Like, you should be hang drying all your stuff. I was like, okay, that's interesting. So the expectation of, do I, as an executive director of an environmental nonprofit, have to be the quote unquote perfect environmentalist? And then what does that mean to other people who want to be a part of this sector? Even in small ways, not necessarily professionally, maybe just in their everyday life. Anyways, for me with biking, like, I didn't grow up biking everywhere. It wasn't something that I did a whole lot. And I've learned about, safety and all that stuff, but it's something I've had to learn as an adult. It wasn't something I was like groomed as a kid. And I'm not trying to make excuses here. I'm just trying to share like my lens, and that it felt, it has felt like I have to be a certain way, and I'm not. And so, and I think a lot of things, it pushes people out rather than inviting people in. And then the last thing about, like, don't have any plastic, it's like, well, I've thrifted stuff. Some stuff I've had for years. Some stuff we're talking about this a lot as a team at ECOSLO, is around like your individual lifestyle or community members versus like systems that have to be torn down. And they're two separate things. And I think that that's really, really important to talk more prominently about in the environmental sector. And then also in regards to plastic, it's so pervasive that sometimes the alternative is cost prohibitive. I remember this was just a few months ago, which I think might have started this idea for this talk, was ECOSLO was doing a virtual event, and we were talking about, you could buy items in glass rather than plastic, like peanut butter. And someone just commented and said, I can't afford that. Like, that's not available to me. So then are we giving, as an organization, are we giving examples of things that are not inviting, and feel like if you don't do this, you're not an environmentalist, you don't care about the planet, like that kind of stuff. And so we've been talking about that a lot more at ECOSLO, which I think has been really great and really important. And I think the sector of environmental work is talking about that in certain areas. I'm not sure, it's happening a lot locally, but we're trying to change that a little bit. And my staff has been really mindful of that. So I'll share this quote. I don't know if anyone has heard of Zero Waste Chef. That's her handle on Instagram. And I'm pretty blown away by how very low waste her lifestyle seems to be. But I was really grateful when she shared this. I don't know the date of when she shared it, but just talking about we don't need a handful of people doing zero waste perfectly, or doing environmentalism perfectly, or doing alternative transportation perfectly, or doing clean energy perfectly. We need millions of people doing it imperfectly. And we have to really embrace like this imperfect path. And it's almost like that word has a negative connotation, which I kind of hate, but it's just like, we're humans, we're learning, and there's so much information coming at us, and there's so many things that we could, you know I personally could do to be more eco-friendly, but I also have to realize limitations, constraints, access, all that sort of stuff. So for someone who has in her name zero waste chef, which I feel like zero waste is like, I don't know how to be zero waste. For her to say this, I think was really helpful, and kind of takes that pressure off, if that makes sense, and is more inviting. And yeah, I think it's just, I kind of put this here about just like expectations that are isolating versus inviting a variety of lifestyles and perspectives to be a part of the environmental community. So I think there's expectations that I've experienced. I think there's things I've even been conditioned on over the past few years that I've had to unlearn, or even just say, question myself on that, or have had someone question me on that. But creating space that is inviting, and is inviting different lenses, different perspectives, different lifestyles. You know, there's some, I have another quote later that I'll share. So we can move on to the next slide. So one thing one of our staff members brought up earlier this year was around this campaign about No New Plastic Week. And the thought about this is to kind of debunk that zero waste, stress, guilt, perfectionism that it seemed like we were headed, that a lot of the environmental sector was headed around, like single-use plastic, as it felt very much like it's my responsibility as a member of my community to like limit the amount of plastic that I have in my life. But then it felt very much like a very high standard of perfectionism, if that makes sense. So what we are doing, and we're actually, this is the last week of the month, we're doing it the last week of every month. So this is the last week of May, which is hard to believe, side note. But it's basically about, can 1 week a month, and you can just do the challenge for a month, or you can do it for the year with us. Like, think about, is it possible to not buy new plastic, to not bring new plastic into your home, to use what you have, to maybe try something that's in a different material, or buy in bulk, or something like that. And it's not something you have to do every day, every week, or throughout the year, but just a challenge of once a week to kind of take a step back and maybe look at an area of your life. Here at ECOSLO, we're focusing on a different area of the household each month. So I think last month we did like kitchen. I think this week might be bathroom. But while there are, systematic changes that have to happen, individual changes, for some people, they can, 0 to 100 go one way to the other. But again, that's around access and privilege and economic access and things like that. And so are there small steps that we're trying to be kind of inviting? Are there small steps that you can take to make changes, to possibly live more sustainably, find more realistic ways to transition to sustainable living? And like I was saying, like separating the two of individual changes versus systematic changes. All right, so privilege in environmental education, environmental advocacy, and then just kind of general nonprofit volunteering are the next 3 things I was going to talk about. So with education, these are just things that I've witnessed. Environmental education. So having time to learn about eco-friendly practices or behaviors or technology, whether that's reading articles, listening to blogs, understanding a study, time is is a privilege for some. And so people may not, because of their job, because of their home life, they may not be able to listen to blogs. I mean, I'm sure a lot of us can find ways to incorporate those in, but at the same, that's a way that people are communicating information now, and it may or may not be accessible for some. I feel like blogs were of a similar trend of getting information out. So I think that there's something to be said there about the time it takes to understand maybe environmental impacts or a study, or yeah, I hope that makes sense around time. The next thing I was thinking about is around access. Your school, maybe an after school program, maybe your clubs that you're involved with are giving you access to environmental education, assuming you're plugged into a school that has access to that, or an after school program or a club or something that has access to that. And that those places have access to books, to research, to the internet, to studies that are, relevant to, or an up to date or relevant to your area. And the next thing is around location. Whether you're in a coastal area, an inland area, what's the size of your community? What kind of resources and support does your community have? That really does influence environmental education. So I'm not going to go too deep in that. I feel like I scratched the surface enough maybe with that, but I think it's thinking about those when we think about environmental education, thinking about those, are these barriers? How can we break through those barriers? How are people and organizations and schools and institutions already doing that? But how are some gaining more and more access and others aren't getting any access whatsoever? The next thing is around advocacy. So with advocacy, I don't know if any of you are on environmental action alerts or any sort of advocacy alert. There's an assumption, and it is a way, I think, to get attention, obviously, around things being really time sensitive. And that there's information you have to understand if you want to sign your name to something, or maybe you don't want to understand it, you just have to sign your name to it, and that's fine. But maybe, again, this is, pre the COVID pandemic, but attending meetings takes time, depending on where those meetings are also. Making a public comment, preparing a letter, that all takes time. And researching and understanding. And if it's important to you, I think you'll find a way. But at the same time, sometimes you have limitations in your life that don't give you the opportunity to participate in something that you want to participate in, because you have other responsibilities, like basic need responsibilities of working, of caring for a family, of caring for parents, grandparents, kids, things like that. I think there's an assumption with advocacy around the ability to respond really quickly. I know that I have experienced that as being a challenge at the rapid pace of which advocacy has to happen. And again, this is a good example of separating the system of whether it's government or private or whatever, only has so many time constraints and things like that, that then nonprofits or community groups have to operate under. So it's not an ideal system anyway. So again, I think maybe separating those two is probably a good thing. But organizations, even like ECOSLO, have to react and say, we have to get comments in within the next week, and then rush to do that. I think this also came up during the pandemic, is around access to phone, computer, internet. Not everyone has access to that 24/7. And it is a privilege to be able to have a cell phone that has access to all of that 24/7. That's something that I know I have experienced that privilege, and then I operate from those assumptions when really those are not assumptions I should be making, but I think they're common to make. And I think this one's important to bring up because May is Mental Health Awareness Month. But urgency language, being someone who's not triggered by urgency language. Some people may tune stuff out because it's too much to be able to absorb that information. And then again, how are we limiting access versus inviting access to comment, to be a part of this? Like, how is a subject line of an email possibly limiting access for folks because they just don't even want to open it up? And then the last thing I put in here around for advocacy example is just comfort level with protests, demonstrations, marches. And again, I wanted, I guess, caveat to this is some people don't have a choice. This is the way they have to get their voice heard, and that these are very important ways to get public attention. At the same time, there are people who are triggered by large crowds, noises, violence, and that may not be an opportunity for them to participate, but an alternative may not have been given to them. Or it's not obvious what an alternative way for them to participate is. And then it feels like they can't be part of the movement because of maybe things that are triggering for them or something they're not comfortable with. The next thing is I put some examples around language, just as examples. Like, I know all caps is, like, everything in all caps is used a lot. So then it feels, I don't know about you guys, but I know sometimes I'm like, someone's screaming at me. That's how I feel like all caps is half the time. I also, I say, there's a lot of things I'm saying that I feel like there's a caveat to or another side to it. The next bullet point is definitely one of those. Sometimes I think about the language of, we need to attack, we need to fight back, we need to resist. And I think about the language and how our language then focuses our efforts. Not that we want to be, happy-go-lucky, positive, toxic positivity all the time. And that anger and strong language or emotionally charged language has a place, but it's the default sometimes I see in this is we must fight back, we must stand up, and it's very like armor up kind of language, which I believe has a place, but also I think there's a need to kind of just step back and evaluate when that language needs to be used, and think about focusing on what it is that we do want, what we do want to give our energy to versus fighting the old, creating the new. Again, I do think there's a caveat there, but that's something that definitely came up, that has come up for me. I alluded to this too about triggering headlines or subject lines, possibly even images that are triggering. And then what is actually urgent in someone's life? Again, I think this is even more exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, but saying urgent, sign on now to this action letter when someone just got laid off from their job, when someone is fighting an illness. Like, obviously as an organization, you don't know what people are going through and you can't cater every message to everyone's individual experience, but it's thinking, I guess, about the defaults of the language and when it is appropriate to use that sort of stuff. Or how can we, again, I feel like I'm saying this over and over again, how can we be more inviting to folks to be participating in this rather than using language that might tune people out? So I kind of pose this question, which is, I did a play on Change the Status Quo, but how can the status quo of environmental advocacy language be changed? Should it be changed? Should it be challenged? Is it effective? Or is it effective for a certain demographic that is used to this and is privileged, straight, male, female, versus language that is more inclusive? Is it just because we've been using this as a sector, we've just been using this language for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years? Should it be changed? Should it be challenged? I don't have a lot of answers with this presentation. I'm just sharing perspectives. So I just wanted to throw that question out there. So the last thing I'll chat about in regards to, at least for this section, is not necessarily related just to the environmental nonprofit sector. I think that this is for the nonprofit sector in general, and that's around volunteering. Volunteering, there's an assumption that someone has, quote unquote, extra time on their evenings, weekends, even weekdays to be able to volunteer their time. That means they don't have to work, they don't have other responsibilities, there's no other real urgent needs, that they have the ability. So I think you could say there is privilege in volunteering, and that it is pulling in a certain demographic of people who have the ability to do that sort of thing. I have an example of this at the nonprofit I worked at before ECOSLO. It was in the Bay Area, and there was a woman volunteering in the food pantry that we had at the nonprofit. And she was from, I think, a European country. She was not from America. And I remember her commenting, all this volunteering is, it's nice. It's nice to be able to give back to the community. But where I'm from, we pay really high taxes to make sure that no one's kind of forgot about, lost in our community. And there's no real opportunity to volunteer because everyone's being taken care of. Whereas in America, we have a food pantry that people who can't access a regular grocery store have to go to a nonprofit, like pseudo grocery store set up for them to be able to access food. So that's been implanted on my mind for like 8 years now, of just that interesting setup that we have made with nonprofits, especially in America. And is it just is volunteering perpetuating a cycle? The other thing I'll just say around, there's actually two things here. One is around transportation. I know that we've experienced this at ECOSLO of, we assume people can get to the beach in Morro Bay and join us for a beach cleanup. And as a small environmental nonprofit, we have found it challenging to try and arrange carpooling or other modes of transportation to get out to a cleanup. And so we've made the assumption that people have a personal vehicle or have access to a vehicle to be able to get them to a cleanup at one place at one time at one date. And in a lot of ways, whether it's a one-time volunteer opportunity like a beach cleanup or an ongoing volunteer opportunity, a lot of the time there's an assumption that you have access to a vehicle. And then there's challenges with unpacking that of, for ECOSLO as a small, community grassroots nonprofit, we have to manage what we have the time and resources to be able to do to support alternatives. Not that it's not important, but it's also nonprofits are typically having to run really efficiently. And sometimes, organizing something like transportation takes a lot of time. Again, it's, I think that it's talking about, privilege here and making assumptions, and it's not necessarily the right ones, but it's just, I'm giving examples of what I've experienced at ECOSLO or in this area. And then the last experience I'll share around this is, if anyone's familiar with our annual event, what we call Creeks to Coast Cleanup, it's part of International Coastal Cleanup Day every September. Last year, we had to change it because of the COVID-19 pandemic. There was no way we were going to hold like 40 or 50 cleanups on one Saturday morning. And what we did instead was put together cleanup kits that people could take and do a cleanup during a 2-week time frame in a location near them, in a location they loved, like at a time and date that worked for them and their household. Well, we've been thinking about that as an organization, and we're not, at least for this year, we're going to do the same thing we did last year, because there's an opportunity there of people who haven't been able to participate in that event before have been able to participate because of doing a cleanup this way. Whether it's based on how they can access a place physically, or time and day, if they have job or family responsibilities that they can't come out on a Saturday morning. And I was speaking with one of my team members earlier today about, I don't know if anyone recalls this quote, it was kind of going around social media this time last year about in the rush to return to quote unquote normal, like, let us think about what is worth returning to that is quote unquote normal. And we felt as an organization, we didn't want to just rush back to what we've done for 16 years. It was like, for a number of reasons, but one of them being like, how has this different way of approaching this event created more access? So that's my thoughts around privilege and volunteering. So the next section is around race, economic status, and ability, and those areas and how they relate to privilege in environmental advocacy and volunteering and education. So one thing with race is around environmental justice, and how people are disproportionately affected based on where they live and the color of their skin, on where facilities are set up, whether that's a wastewater treatment plant, whether that's something like these climate induced weather, or I'm blanking on my words, something like Hurricane Katrina. How did that disproportionately affect people in different communities with different economic statuses, with different races? And that was unjust. And we think about that with these climate, these weather patterns that are stronger, more forceful, and how are they affecting various communities? Housing. I put tobacco in here because there's a tobacco control coalition locally, and it talks about how things like menthol are disproportionately marketed to Black communities, and that those communities are targeted, and that there needs to be advocacy. There is advocacy, and it's raising the voices of people who are experiencing that, and educating around that, and knowing that the private sector tobacco industry is targeting certain people based on their race, based on where they live, based on their economic status. And then there's a lot of unpacking that comes with that, but I put these in there as examples. One thing that comes up a lot, I would say, is around landfills, and where are those located? Where are oil fields located? And how is that affecting different communities? So one thing I linked here is, if you have not heard of Intersectional Environmentalist, that is a great website and resource, and I would encourage you to check that out. I'm of the place of, I want to, and I have some more handles to share out at the end of this presentation, but I think that this is an important one to share out, and one that was definitely shared widely this time last year. I think when it also comes to race, it's about representation matters, and amplifying people who are already doing the work, whether that's in our community or not. And that I know that has helped me understand different perspectives, different lenses, and that's really important. I think this is coming up a lot with social media around, is this our news source now? And we're choosing to hear what our news source is, and we're choosing who to hear from. So if I'm only hearing from straight white women, I have a certain influence that is being put on me. But if I actively try to diversify who I am hearing from, different perspectives will be implanted on me, which is important. But I think that that's something we're challenged with as a community. Yeah, I think that's good. Yeah, let's move on to the next slide around economic status and access. I have a little, I'm not sure the right words around this one. That's what I kind of landed on. And I just gave some examples here around based on, based on your income, your family's income, your household, what do you have access to? And one thing I think that's talked about in the environmental community is outdoor experiences and gear, and talking about the fees to access places, the cost of the gear to do those things that are such amazing experiences in nature. I think one example, though it doesn't affect SLO County because we don't get snow here necessarily, but like skiing and snowboarding is a very expensive sport, but people find a way to connect with nature in that way. And in some ways that's very limiting because of the cost it takes to be able to participate in something like that. And so I think that's an example. I think you could say the same for possibly rock climbing or some, the amount of gear. And not to say that there's not places that, make it more accessible, or if there's a will, there's a way kind of thing. But at the same time, what systems are set up to make it more accessible for others and less accessible to others. And then around this is more general for the nonprofit sector, but for many, working in this sector is not financially sustainable, and they can't do it for the long term, or they need multiple incomes. They need a partner to be able to work in the nonprofit industry, and that's not limited to just environmental. I say that as the sector. I think things are changing. I think there's, more advocacy and awareness around this, but it's definitely been a tradition of the nonprofit sector is that it is hard to make ends meet working in the sector. And then the last thing I was going to give examples of is around ability. I've been in some groups around trail access or open space preservation, and we talk about the same user groups, those that walk or hike, those that mountain bike. Again, another expensive opportunity to experience nature, can be expensive. Horseback riding, again, could be another expensive opportunity to experience nature. What about persons with disabilities or different abilities? And I know one example someone gave me of their son was on the autism spectrum, and they're like, there's no way I'm taking them to any city open space because there's going to be a user group on there that my child is not going to respond well. And so how are we limiting access to different folks because we're so focused on the same groups instead of questioning those assumptions that we're making, or inviting nonprofits or community groups or family groups to be part of these discussions, who have different lenses or backgrounds that they can operate from. So again, my question there about how to create space that is inviting and creating more access for folks. I have just a couple slides left. And this one's around kind of unpacking some of the actions or trends. And I just gave a couple examples on the next slide. Is one around the term zero waste. I think I mentioned this one earlier around, putting responsibility on us as individuals or us as a small community rather than the systems. Another one is around electrification. There's talk around we just have to transition everything from gas and fossil fuels to electricity, but there's not a huge conversation around what about reducing our resources? What about reducing the pull? Like, solar and wind is better than pulling oil from the ground, but we're not talking about how to reduce it. It's not talked about as commonly about reducing our consumption habits. So again, trying to kind of challenge the conversation that's happening. And then another example for ECOSLO is around we have a new green business certification program, and it's part of a statewide program. And I'm so grateful because they're talking about equity on a statewide level. And we're talking about how some businesses don't have time, they don't have money, they might have a language barrier that makes it really difficult for them to be able to access or have time to go through a green business certification. That's a limit in and of itself. And so are we as an organization assuming people have that privilege that they have no constraints with time, money, or language to be able to do this program with us? The next slide is from another person I shared at the end. I saw this shared on, I need to make it bigger so I can read it. But I thought it was a perfect way to kind of, I don't know, summarize what we're talking about. Like, some people who are vegan fly all the time, maybe not during COVID, but there could be that. There's people who eat meat, but they shop local. There's thrift people who thrift, but they get takeout coffee all the time. Like, there's these juxtapositions, and like, I don't know, hopefully this slide makes sense of like, it kind of aligns with, you know, ECOSLO wanting to test out this like no new plastic week challenge of like, we're all doing the best that we can. There's a lot going on in the world, and we have to take it step by step. We have to think about our individual lives, and then we also have to think about the systems that are in place. And just keep the focus that we are, what you do makes a difference. It does, you know, matter to others. It matters to your community. It might inspire someone else to make a change. You never kind of know of the difference or the influence. And I'm a big believer of that actions speak louder than words. The last example I'll give here is this is the beginning of a quote. It's not the full quote, from Lila June, who is an indigenous, I would call her an indigenous activist. I'm not sure how she defines herself. But I know I have heard several times in the environmental community talk about, oh, if humans just would stop destroying the planet, like if humans weren't here, the planet would heal itself, kind of like talking down about humans. And I really, her words really landed on me around, I don't know if you recall the language last year about, oh, we're all not driving, like the earth is healing, like the planet, you know, could not be in a better state now that we've all stopped, kind of thing. And her response was, the answer is not to stay inside. Rather, when this is quote unquote over, we must go outside and interact with the planet, with her, in a completely different way. Human beings were designed to be a keystone species, upholding whole food webs and ecosystems. I know this because I've seen it. Our ancestors proved that there is a way to be so good to the earth that if we were to leave, she would actually miss us. And there's more to that quote, and I invite you to look at it. It is from April of last year. But I think, again, just kind of what I shared at the beginning of this presentation is around some of the things that are just said offhandedly in the environmental community, and how that is not inviting people, it's not inspiring people to get involved. It's in fact pushing people away and limiting it. And I think that the talk about humans in a negative light can be really harsh, to feel that way and to feel the weight of that responsibility. So the last thing is, I just shared some folks that I follow that have helped influence me. I don't know if Catherine or Megan, if you're able to share this out, or if people just want to take a screenshot or something. But these are, and not all of them are environmental focused ones. But just wanted to share that out with all of you, because I have found these folks really helpful for me in unpacking my privilege, unpacking my lenses, understanding different perspectives, and changing who I'm listening to predominantly, and to stop perpetuating the cycle I feel like I got fed into. So that's all I have to share. Thank you very much. Thank you again for the opportunity. Sorry, I almost came up on time there.